You're either winning or you're learning. As long as you're trying, you can't lose. And I think a lot of people, they just don't make changes because it seems impossible. Welcome to Build Beyond, a podcast designed to challenge and guide you on your health journey so that you can meet your full potential. For this episode, I want to talk about what prevents people from making the obvious changes. When I have new patients, I always ask what they think is going on. So I will phrase it like this. I'll say, you know your body better than anyone. What do you think is going on? What do you think you need? It's very common for people to stare at me blankly with the look of, that's why I'm coming to you. They're coming for me to answer those questions. But people are surprisingly intuitive. And I would say for most of the things that I deal with, there is no singular root cause. There are many factors contributing to people's pain and people's disability. So when I have people take some time to reflect, whatever they say is almost always correct. It's always a piece of it. And the very interesting thing is that people tend to say the things that motivate them the most or that they're the most concerned about. And I think a lot of times people will second guess their intuition and when they really know what their body needs to a certain extent. Now, I'm obviously here to provide my expertise. Sometimes people aren't completely accurate. Sometimes they're inaccurate because they've been told certain things that aren't true or maybe are misleading or don't really apply to their case specifically. But if I had to say a percentage, I should probably keep track of this. I would say it's probably 95% or more of the things that come out of people's mouths when I ask them what they need, because they know their body better than anyone else. They're correct. They do need those things. Or those fears are legitimate and we need to address those. Which is interesting because if you think about health in general or pain management, it's a problem. Chronic pain is a problem. Chronic diseases are problems in society. But it's interesting because so we have these big problems that cost a bunch of money and cause a bunch of disability. And we have people with these problems who intuitively know what they need to do to fix it or to address it or just to make things better. So what's in the middle stopping that action? And that's the $1 million question. And I think a lot of people just don't really consider it, or they consider it too much. So they have paralysis by analysis. And they feel like in order to get what they want, the changes that they'd have to make and everything they have to do it's a mountain that's insurmountable. So why even take one step? If you can't do 100%, why do 1%? Why even take that first step? And as a human and as a patient, not just a healthcare provider, I totally get that. I know how that feels. But it's an interesting thing if you're going through this and this speaks to you a little bit. Maybe this is your experience or has been your experience. What is preventing you from taking the next step or the first step? Now, a lot of times, if people have already come to see me, that's the first step. Or sometimes, actually, more often than not, I'm one of the last steps. They've seen a lot of different people and things haven't worked. So they just end up in my office hoping that I can provide some type of insight or some type of help, something different. And a lot of times what I offer people are lifestyle changes. And a lot of times they're very basic and people already kind of know what they need to do. They just need help structuring it. So for example, if you were to walk into any urgent care and talk to anyone in there, so anyone who's got some type of chronic issue, heart disease, diabetes, for example, and you ask them what they need to do in order to improve their situation, they're all going to tell you the same. Everybody knows they probably need to exercise more. They need to fix their diet. They need to sleep better. They'll rattle off a list of things if you can get them talking. And then you would ask them, well, are you doing those things? And a lot of people are going to say no. So I don't think it's a lack of knowledge for most people. I don't think it's a lack of knowledge that is preventing them from making the obvious choices. For many people, it's a mental block. There's a lack of motivation. And it's not that they're not motivated to get better, because people are. They just haven't found the motivation to do the obvious things that they need to get better, because the obvious things are simple, but they're difficult. So something can be simple and difficult at the same time. So for example, if you need to lose weight, well, going into a caloric deficit, simply put, is going to accomplish that for you. It's very simple, but it's really hard to do. So people will look at that simplicity and they'll think of simple, and if it's so simple, it should be easy, but it's not. And then they look at this simple task of, let's say, for example, going into a caloric deficit, and then they fail at it and they feel like a failure. And then they're really hard on themselves for it. And I think that fear of failure is a problem. And a lot of times it's fear of failure because they've experienced failure and they don't want to feel that again, or they feel hopeless. And recently I ran across a really neat clip, and I want to play it right now. And this discussion is about acting and taking risks with acting. But as you're listening to this, I want you to think about any of the changes that you need to make or that you feel like you should make in your life.
I wonder if you're hard on yourself, like if you've learned to be more or less judgmental as you've gone through this career, because I would think as an actor, it just invites self-criticism if you're not careful.
I think I am, but maybe less so, because, you know, you see rhythms of failure and success and appreciation and rejection and all that. And you want things to go well, but you know you survive things. And I think it makes you a little easier and a little bit like, I always like this idea of trying to fail.
What do you mean?
Just think about that. Like if try to make a bad painting, try to act badly, try to be lousy in that scene. It's interesting. It kind of puts the idea of striving for perfection on, you know, it does something.
Yeah. In other words, so maybe try really hard to fail and then watch playback and go, that was interesting, right?
Or you've got to find ways to let you not worry and be free, you know? That's all. And once again, we're talking triggers, you know? If you're content to fail, or you accept it somewhere, and I only mention this because you talk about being hard on yourself, because the idea of being hard on yourself is kicking yourself for not doing better, not doing better, not doing better. So you got to deal with this striving impulse, which can hurt you, you know? You need enough to get you in movement and get you trying things, but you don't need so much that it suffocates you, that you're uptight. So I'm just saying, sometimes I flirt with ideas of fucking things up or not being hard on myself, or, you know.
I mean, that's a brave statement, I think. And it's also, to put that into practice takes some confidence.
Well, also you put yourself in situations where you can't control things.
Right. Well, that's the life of an actor, right?
A little bit. Yeah. And that's why, you know, people say, that's so risky. You know, it's only risky if it's not risky. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's only risky if it's not risky, meaning...
If it's a real risk, you're trying something.
Right.
Something will happen. Something will be learned. It's risky. If you know what it is, it's absolutely controlled. You know, that's what'll kill you.
Yeah.
Creatively.
I love that. So it's only risky if it's not risky. And I'm not saying you should go out and do something risky, like some risky diet or some risky medication or some risky workout. But I think when we're thinking about lifestyle changes and the obvious changes that you need to make, risky is just for a lot of people that fear of failure. So you can flirt with the idea of failure. Consider the realistic possibility that the changes that you need to make are simple but difficult, and that you will not succeed the first time. And you may not succeed the second time or the third time, but you're going to learn something. So if you put yourself out there and you do something that is challenging, that has a higher likelihood of failure, something will happen. And even if you don't get to make the changes that you want to, you will learn from that. I love that there's another saying that there's no such thing as winning or losing. You're either winning or you're learning. As long as you're trying, you can't lose. And I think a lot of people, they just don't make changes because it seems impossible. But I would argue that taking that first step, whatever the first step is, it doesn't really matter. That's really important. And as he said in that video, just think about it. Like, what is it for him? What would it be like to paint a bad painting or act badly? For you, what would, if you're not, for example, if you know you need to exercise and you're willing to start walking more, maybe to go on a walk a couple times a week, what could go wrong? Like, how would you walk badly? That, what would that even look like? And you might say, well, there is no possibility of that. And I think I could walk around the block. I can make time for that. Well, great, do that. And if you were terrified to go to the gym, well, what would that actually look like? To put on your gym shoes and go in there and have a bad workout and do a bad job. At least you're training. At least you're doing something, you're learning, and you're moving in the right direction. And a lot of times with these things, having help is really beneficial. And I've said that so many times on this podcast. Having a guide for some people is vital. But even with a guide, even if you were to work with me as your guide, I'm really just going to find creative ways to put you in uncomfortable positions where you could fail, because that's where you can learn and that's where you can adapt, because that's real life. So I think if your goal is complete comfort and no pain, that's hard. And if your goal is no risk, that's also hard. Now we can adjust the risk. So you can look at doing a risk assessment. So we look at whatever you're dealing with, your injuries, because sometimes you may have tissue damage, sometimes you may not. So how much can your body actually take? How much can those tissues accept? How much pain can you withstand before it sends you into like a downward spiral of pain? So we keep you on the other side of that. And then we look at your goals and we look at the exercises and the activities that are going to help you meet those goals, but at the same time, not push you too hard. So we can look at like frequency, intensity, the type of exercise or the type of activity, and the time frame, how many times we're doing it, how long we're doing it. We kind of match those up. And that's our risk assessment. And then we can look at risk tolerance. For example, if you have someone, let's say we have an Olympic athlete at the Olympic Games with an ankle injury, their risk tolerance is pretty high. If they're already at the games, they're going to want to push it, and they're going to be willing to accept a long-term injury, possibly, especially if they think they can medal. Where someone who's not a competitive athlete, doesn't have any aspirations of going to the Olympics with the same ankle injury, they may have a different risk tolerance. They may not want to push it. So we really have to look at all those different factors, and that's where it can be helpful to have someone. But going back to the reason why I wanted to do this podcast is I feel like there's so much paralysis by analysis. And when people don't make the obvious changes that they know they need to make, a lot of times it comes down to lack of confidence and this fear of failure. What happens if I don't do it right? And And that's why I really love that video clip, because just accept, at least do a thought experiment where you can accept the possibility of failure and be okay with that. And if you acknowledge that short-term failure is a possibility, it's not just a possibility, it's going to happen at some point, then maybe that doesn't suffocate you. Maybe you don't put those unrealistic expectations on yourself that you have to hit a home run every time you step up to the plate. And your inability to knock it out of the park every time, it's not mean that you're a bad person, or that you're worse than someone else, or that you have it worse than someone else. I think it just means that you have unrealistic expectations. And that's, if you can remove those and stop suffocating yourself and realize that this is a process and that trying is all that matters, and then learning from when you don't accomplish something, you didn't fail, you're going to learn from that. I think that's the valuable piece. I hope this helps anyone who's listening to this and is having troubles getting started, or having troubles because you keep getting started and on a process, but then you can't stick with it. And if that's you, maybe you would benefit from someone like me, or anyone, maybe even not a healthcare provider, but someone who's been through what you've been through. So a coach, or just a friend, a mentor, someone to guide you, because that can be really helpful, especially when you hit roadblocks. All right, I hope this has been helpful. Thanks for listening. I'll see you later.